Hi, I have been meaning to make a video on the CPF, on the Central Provident Fund, retirement fund in Singapore, to highlight what the problems are as well as what the solutions can be. So first, let's start off with how much Singaporeans are paying. Singaporeans pay about 37% of their wages into the CPF, of which 23% actually goes into the OA. There is 8% that goes into the MA, that's the Medisave account. The OA is the ordinary account. And 6% goes into the special account, the SA, for retirement. So the OA, the ordinary account, can be used for both housing as well as retirement if there is still some money left inside the OA. The Medisave account is used for healthcare, and the special account is a dedicated account for retirement. So what we know is that for Singaporeans aged about 55 or so, inside their OA, inside their ordinary account, they would have spent about 55% of it to pay for HDB housing loans. So there would only be about 45% at age 55 that is actually used for retirement. You can imagine that for someone who's 25 or 30 or 35, they would actually be using up almost all their ordinary account to pay for the housing loan if you do your calculations based on the current housing prices. Now, under the ordinary account, Singaporeans actually take about, if they use up the whole ordinary account to pay for housing, and for HDB public housing flats, it includes the land cost, because in 1985, the government made an amendment to include land costs into the market, land costs at market price into the HDB flat price. So the estimates are that about 60% of the HDB flat actually goes into land costs. So what we know about the land cost is that it goes into the reserves in Singapore, the national reserves, and the reserves actually go into the GIC. So the GIC gets to invest the reserves, and Temasek Holdings, in an amendment in 2014, actually has access to the reserves and has access to this money as well. Now, the thing is, the land actually does not belong to Singaporeans, because for HDB public housing flats, Singaporeans only lease the flat for 99 years, and they do not have any ownership over the land. So when Singaporeans pay 60% of the HDB public housing flat price into the land, this money is land that actually disappears, because Singaporeans are paying money into something they do not own, and this money goes into the reserves eventually and does not come back to Singaporeans in that sense. So of the 37% of the CPF that Singaporeans pay into wages, about 13.8% or around 14% of this money is actually money that goes away. It's money that does not return to Singaporeans because it's paid into the land. So that's the problem of the housing flat prices, and how the housing flat prices are priced, that cause Singaporeans to sacrifice quite a huge chunk of their CPF into the land that does not come back to them. So let's move on to the Medisave account. Of the 37% that Singaporeans pay, about 8% at age 35 goes into the Medisave account. So I'm just using age 35 as a gauge, as the benchmark as which we talk about this discussion for now. For Medisave, the Medisave balance as of 2016 is, the balance is 88.6 billion, of which the expenses that Singaporeans actually pay get back. So how much Singaporeans can withdraw from the Medisave to pay for medical expenses, this is 964 million. Okay, I know the handwriting is a bit unclear, but you can also take note of what I say as I write down the values on your own piece of paper so that you can do the calculations. You can actually find this statistic on the Ministry of Health website on healthcare expenditure. So, of the total Medisave balance that Singaporeans have paid from 1984 to 2016, I think, 2017. So in 2017, Singaporeans have paid $88.6 billion in total. And in 2017, they are only able to get back 964 million. And if you work it out, this money that Singaporeans can get back in terms of expenses is only 1% of the total Medisave balance. Now, one thing you have to ask is, why is it from 1984 Singaporeans have accumulated such a huge balance and only 1% gets returned? For Singaporeans who have passed on, technically the Medisave gets returned to them. So why is there such a huge balance? And why is it that only 1% goes back to Singaporeans? This is a question that you have to ask. Of the Medisave balance that does not get returned for medical expenses, it goes into the reserves, and then it goes into the GIC, of which Temasek Holdings has access as well. Now, this is the total Medisave balance, but what if we look at the annual contributions into Medisave on an annual basis? The CPF board does not actually provide statistics on this, but the CPF board provides statistics on the overall CPF that is contributed on an annual basis. So if you look at 2016, in 2016, the CPF board has, Singaporeans had contributed into CPF 35.8 billion. Now, Medisave accounts for 8% out of 37% of the CPF, and this proportion increases as after 45, after 55, and so on. So the minimum that Singaporeans actually contribute into the Medisave is 8% out of 37%. That's the minimum. So based on that, how much Singaporeans are contributing into Medisave is at least 7.8 billion. At least it should go up to about 10 billion or so. That's a better estimate. And when we look at how much Singaporeans actually get back from Medisave in terms of medical expenses, we get back only 931 million in 2016, sorry. So that is only about 10%. If you look at 931 million divided by this amount, you will get about 10% if you take an average value. So what this means is that of the annual Medisave contributions that Singaporeans pay on an annual basis, they only get back about 10%. So of the total Medisave balance that Singaporeans have paid since 1984, we get back 1%. But on an annual basis, we get back about 1%, which means that about 7.2% of this 8% is actually not returned to Singaporeans, which goes into the balance. And this 7.2% also goes into the reserves, which is invested by the GIC and which Temasek Holdings has access to as well. So this is one problem the first problem I highlighted to you was how the ordinary account is used to pay for housing, of which this money goes into the land, which does not get returned to Singaporeans and goes into the reserves and is invested by the GIC. The other part of it is how of the contributions that Singaporeans pay into Medisave every year, about they only get to use about 10% on an annual basis, and only 1% of the total balance, of which the rest goes into the reserves and is used by the GIC for investments, as well as Temasek Holdings, which has access to the reserves based on the 2004 amendments to the Reserves Act. So now let's move on to the special account. The special account can be used for retirement. So at age 55, whatever Singaporeans have left in the ordinary account is channeled into the retirement account. This is what is happening. And whatever Singaporeans have left inside the special account is also channeled into the retirement account. So there is a max of a full retirement sum that Singaporeans have to channel in every year. Sorry, not every year, but for everyone who's at 55, most people would have to channel whatever they have inside the ordinary account and whatever they have into the special account, from the special account into this retirement account, because the full retirement fund, or previously known as the CPF minimum sum, is actually quite a high amount. So most Singaporeans would not have enough inside their CPF. Prior to 2015, so before 2015, whatever Singaporeans have inside the retirement account, they earn interest on the retirement account, and at 65, they would be able to withdraw this as payouts on a monthly basis that they get. After 2015, what the government did was to channel this retirement account into an account called the Lifelong Income Fund. It's also called the CPF Life. Now the difference is that in the past, this is your retirement account and you earn interest on the retirement account because this is your savings. But under CPF Life, there's interest earned, yes, but the interest earned will not be returned to you. In the past, after a person passes on, whatever is left inside the retirement account, including the interest, is returned to the family members. But now, the interest will not be returned to the family members, only whatever is left inside the balance. The problem is that the CPF board has said that the balance will be able to cover you. The way they have calculated it is that it will be able to cover you until 79 years old if you're on the standard plan. The life expectancy in Singapore for men is 81 years old, and for women is 85 years old. And about half of the elderly population actually passes on by age 85. This means that if you pass on before 79, whatever interest earned will never be returned to you in terms of payouts. And because most Singaporeans half of Singaporeans at least would pass on by age 85, it also means that nearly half of Singaporeans will never be able to touch this interest rates. Of course, if you are older than 85, you would be able to access some of these interest rates as payouts. But for the payouts that are not actually given back to older Singaporeans, they will go into the reserves, which will be invested by the GIC and which Temasek Holdings has access to. Now, we know from this year that the average CPF payout is $355 every month for elderly, which means elderly Singaporeans aged 65 and above are only able to get back $355 on average. We know that 70% of elderly Singaporeans aged 65 and above only get back less than $500. Based on a study by NUS, SMU, NTU, and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, the minimum that an elderly needs for retirement is $1,379, which means that 70% of elderly Singaporeans can only get back about a third of what they actually need on the very basic level, which means that for 70% of the population, it's not adequate. We do not know how many people actually are able to get back $1,379. But the majority of the elderly aged 65 and above are actually getting back poverty payouts from the CPF. So what is the solution? Right now, I think let's look at the housing problem first, and then we'll come back to this. The housing problem, it is actually very easy to resolve the issue. First, public housing, HDB, is public housing, and if land is not owned by Singaporeans, well, there is no need to pay for this land. So Singaporeans should only have to pay for this ordinary account that we are actually paying for the HDB loan. If 60% is for the land, this is money that we shouldn't actually have to pay. We should only need to pay for 40%. And this will free up about 14% of what we pay into the land currently. That is money that is freed up. And if housing prices are reduced to 40% of their current price, if we only include the construction costs and a bit of the administrative charges, say for another 1 to 5% or so, we would only pay less than half of what we're currently paying for HDB prices. So this is one money that is freed up. And if we are able to free up this money, we would have about 14% plus 6%, that's about 20%, that would be able to go back into paying for retirement. 20% or so would be about 3 times what is currently placed inside the special account for retirement. Just by it being 3 times more, it should allow for current payouts to be multiplied by 3, which would allow all elderly Singaporeans to be able to have enough inside their CPF to meet the basic amount required for retirement. Now, this is not even including for the compounding interest, which means that including for the compounding interest, elderly Singaporeans might not only just get $1,379, they might get $1,005, they might even get up to $2,000. So immediately you see that by freeing up money that we are paying into the land, which we should not pay because the land is not owned by us, all elderly Singaporeans would be able to retire quite comfortably and with the basic, and to be able to have basic living. Now, 20%, this money that is freed up from housing, including the special account and whatever you have inside an ordinary account that is left after paying for housing, is actually quite excessive. Based on a study that does a literature review, it shows that people in America and some other countries will only need 15% of their wages plus a 4% real interest to be able to get an adequate replacement rate for retirement, which means that we are actually overpaying. So this, we can actually reduce the amount. So that's for housing and that's for retirement. We will come back to this in a bit. So you have the solution for housing, you have the solution for retirement. These are things that we can do under the current system that we have. We do not need to increase tax. In fact, we can even cut down what we pay on the CPF. So this is already something that we can do within the CPF that we're paying. The next thing I'm going to talk about is to come back to the Medisave. As I told you just now, of the Medisave that Singaporeans pay every year, about 10% is used for medical expenses. Now, if you look at the total health expenditure, I've calculated based on data from the Global Health Data Observatory, Global Health Observatory Data Repository from the World Health Organization, that of the total health expenditure every year, Medisave only covers for about 5%. This is for the total health expenditure. So for the Medisave contributions that Singaporeans pay a year, 10% is used for the Medisave. This Medisave only contributes to about 5% of the total health expenditure. Now, out-of-pocket expenditure is about 30% in Singapore. It used to be about 50%, 60%. I'm not quite sure what is happening with the statistics because of a lack of clarity, but based on the World Health Organization, it's about 30%. The rest is covered by Medisave, Medishield, and taxes. So 30% is about 6 times of 5%, or 6 times what Medisave currently covers. So if we assume that we can use Medisave to cover this 30%, 6 times more, and so 6 times more, if we look at how much we are using from Medisave now, Medisave uses 10%. 6 times of 10% is another 60%, which means that it will only reach 70%. Even if we use another 60% of what we pay into Medisave to cover for this 30% out-of-pocket expenditure, we are only still using up to about 70% of what we pay into Medisave on an annual basis. And by just using 70%, we will be able to have free healthcare for all Singaporeans, because it would cover for the out-of-pocket expenditure, with the rest covered by taxes, Medishield, Medisave, Medifund. And we would still have 30% left on what we pay on the Medisave on an annual basis. So then you can see that Singaporeans are actually overpaying on the Medisave. The government is actually collecting a lot more Medisave than what is necessary. So what is the problem with the Medisave right now? The problem is that under the current Medisave structure, there is a limit on how much Singaporeans can use, which means that then it prevents you from being able to use more of what you contribute. The other thing is that there is no risk pooling, which means that Singaporeans are not able to use the maximum amount of fund that is available inside the Medisave. If we are able to, and there are studies by the International Monetary Fund, which IMF, which says that Singapore's medical savings cost scheme, the Medisave, is actually very unequal because of the lack of risk pooling. And if this is changed into a medical insurance scheme, like almost a lot of the developed countries, what they're doing, we would then be able to have free healthcare by allowing what we're paying into the Medisave to be risk pooled, to pay for the out-of-pocket expenditure, so that there will be free healthcare. So based on this, I've already explained that we can have affordable housing if we do not pay for the land costs, and this money would be freed up to allow us to have adequate retirement payouts at 65 for all Singaporeans. And if we are able to allow what we actually contribute into Medisave to be used for healthcare, we would have free healthcare. So the problem, therefore, is solved. One other problem is that Singaporeans are actually paid the lowest wages among the developed countries and among countries with a similar cost of living, say above US $35,000 GDP per capita. And Singapore has a GDP per capita about twice that amount. So if you just look at comparing that, and you compare how much cleaners and security guards are earning as compared to the minimum wages of all these countries, Singaporeans actually earn the lowest wages. And if you compare the median wage with all these high income countries, Singaporeans are also one of the lowest, I think about the bottom two or three, which means that Singaporeans are actually earning much lower wages than what they should be earning based on the GDP per capita and based on the cost of living. And if we increase the wages, it means that based on the current contribution of 37%, the contribution will be increased. So it also means that the retirement payouts will be increased. It also means that what we pay to Medisave will increase, and it will be able to cover for Medisave as well. But knowing that we are already overpaying for Medisave, and knowing that we only need 15% for retirement, but if we freed up what we are paying, we are actually paying about 20%, so overpaying about 5%. It is actually possible to reduce what Singaporeans are paying into the CPF. So there are some things you have to consider. CPF is actually used for retirement, Medisave, and housing right now. And it complicates the issue because we do not know exactly how much we are paying into housing right now. And it saps out a lot of the money from the CPF into the reserves. So if we make it very clear, if we can separate the CPF, so if we only need 15% for retirement, so 15% for CPF, and if the current 8% that we're paying into Medisave, we only need about 7%, so let's say we only need about 6%. So retirement, 15%, Medisave or a new health insurance scheme, if we may, 6%. We only need 15 plus 6, 21% for retirement and healthcare. That means we are overpaying on about 37 minus 21, that's about 16%. We are overpaying about 16% into our CPF right now. Now imagine if this 16% goes back into your own pocket. You can choose to invest it in bonds, etc. This is money you can choose to use to buy your own flats or to invest and buy a flat at a later age. And when Singaporeans are paid higher wages on par with the other developed countries, you can imagine how much more Singaporeans would have on hand to invest and pay for housing. So I'm going to sum up very quickly now. The problem that we have with the current system is that we are overpaying on the CPF. There is a lack of transparency on how much we are paying into housing, and we are paying in our CPF into land which does not belong to us, which we should not have to pay. And in doing so, we would, from the current inadequate retirement payouts that we're getting, we would be able to ensure that all Singaporeans would have adequate payouts. Singaporeans are also overpaying on Medisave, getting back only 1% of the total balance and 10% on the contributions we pay every year. And if we pay from 8%, we pay only 6%, we would actually be able to get free health care for everyone. And when our wages are increased, and when we actually look at separating the components to have 15% for retirement, 6% for healthcare, and the rest as money in our own pockets, we actually would have enough for retirement, enough for healthcare, and enough for housing, in addition to investments that we want to make, maybe setting up a business. Now, all this means that in the past, at 55, Singaporeans will get back a lump sum from their amount from the CPF. Now, the question I want to put to Singaporeans is, do you want to go back to a system where you get back a lump sum at 55? Or do you want the choice to say that the government should guarantee you an amount of payout that is adequate for the cost of living so that you get it for life. And this system that I am proposing right now, based on what is currently doable under the system, is that instead of sacrificing a lot of the money into the reserves which goes into the GIC, the land, the additional surplus from Medisave that goes into the reserves and GIC that Singaporeans actually do not benefit from, we take the money back. We look at how much we actually need for retirement and healthcare, and we invest it in its own. And whatever interest is earned is kept by the retirement fund and by the Medisave and by the healthcare fund, and then return. All this means that there needs to be very clear transparency where I know how much I am earning inside the CPF or inside a retirement fund. I am very clear that I know how much I am earning inside the healthcare fund. I know where the funds are being invested. I know how much people who are managing these funds are earning, so that there is clear transparency and accountability on an annual basis where I know how much interest is earned on an annual basis, how much the payouts are calculated, so that it is not like under the current system where you do not know how your payout is actually calculated, that it is calculated until 95 years old, because that's the default calculation under the CPF life payout now. So if there is transparency in all of this, I believe that a proper system that will actually take care of Singaporeans would be to designate a clear retirement account which will guarantee lifetime payouts at an adequate level based on the current calculations by NUS, SMU, NTU, and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. This is about $1,400, and this is doable under the current system. And if the interest rates are returned, this is all doable. And if we pay whatever is necessary into the healthcare, we would get free healthcare. This is all doable. So right now, my question to Singaporeans is, based on the current system, if we do not pay unnecessary money into the GIC and into the Temasek Holdings, where we get back control and power, where the interest is earned on our own money, and where we have very clear allocation into retirement, healthcare, and you can actually keep your own money for your housing, we would be able to have adequate retirement funds and free healthcare. Is this something that you want as compared to the system that we have right now? So this is something you have to think about. And if this is a system that you believe, this system that I am proposing is a system that you believe is workable, then my question to you is, will the PAP do this? Now I'm going to tell you very clearly that the PAP won't do this, because even in 2015, when they came out of the CPF Life, what they did was to take your interest away and to calculate using the fund that you already have in your retirement account to pay out until you are nearly 80 years old, when most people would nearly pass on, which means that the interest won't even be returned. And the payout age is calculated until 95, which means that a lot of the interest is actually earned by the GIC and Temasek Holdings. Even under a reform, the money is not paid to you. This is the first thing. Second thing is that the PAP has refused to allow the GIC and Temasek Holdings to be delinked from the CPF such that you invest your own money and you earn your own interest. And if you look at the global situation, on average, the interest rates would generally be higher, even if in some years the interest is lower or even negative, but on average, it evens out and there is a higher interest rate. So now, the PAP, even if in its reforms on the CPF in 2015, is not willing to return the interest rates, they are not willing to delink the GIC and Temasek Holdings, Even Lee Kuan Yew himself said in 2001 and 2006 that there is no direct connection between the GIC and Temasek holdings. And it is only in 2014 that the government admitted that yes, the CPF is invested in the GIC. So you can see that on many levels. There's no transparency as to how the funds in GIC and Temasek holdings are invested. There's no transparency as to how the CPF payouts are calculated. There's no transparency as to the average interest rates that the CPF is currently earning. There's no transparency as to how much HDB public housing flats are actually calculated. On that basis, there's no transparency on how the government is taking your CPF funds to use. And actually a lot of it eventually is earned by the GIC and Temasek holdings, where the Prime Minister is the chairperson and his wife is a CEO. And the Prime Minister in 2007 has also said that he does not believe that transparency is everything. So it is quite clear that if you want to have free healthcare, which is doable under the current payout that Singaporeans are making, and if you want to have adequate retirement funds under the current payout that Singaporeans are already making, and if you want to have affordable housing under the current payout that Singaporeans are having, the only way you are able to have this is if you have a government that is committed to transparency, and it is not going to be doable under the PAP because there's a lack of transparency. It is difficult for them to be transparent because if they do, a lot of these issues will unravel. And if you know that a lot of these will unravel, if you are the PAP, would you be transparent? Would you want people to know and blame you for it? I think not. So the only way that this can be done is if there are new people inside the government who will be able to look at the records, who will be able to say the GIC Temasek Holdings reserves CPF, all the records have to be transparent, has to be made public, so that you can then be involved in the calculation to say, yeah, we are paying more than we should be paying. We should limit and separate what we're paying so that we can have a system that would ensure adequate payouts, free healthcare, affordable housing, which is all doable. Now, one last thing. The PAP keeps telling Singaporeans, the PAP keeps saying that the CPF is not taxed. Now, in other countries, say in the Nordic countries in Norway, they pay an average tax of about 37 to 39% or so, and that money is used to pay for retirement, housing, education, pretty much things that the CPF pay for. So in name, the CPF is not tax, but it works the same way as tax in the Nordic countries and Europe and the other developed countries. And when Norway is paying 37 to 39% and Singaporeans are paying 37%, Singaporeans are actually paying high taxes as well. The other thing is, in Norway, cleaners, bus drivers earn higher wages. Cleaners earn about 5,000 Singapore dollars in wages, while cleaners in Singapore earn $1,000. On top of paying high taxes for cleaners who are earning $1,000 only, in Norway they earn about 5,000 and they earn 37, and they only pay 37% in tax. So let me just draw this out. This is Norway, 5,000. This is Singapore, $1,000 for cleaners. They pay 37%, so let's say about 40% in taxes. In Singapore, cleaners pay about 40% in CPF, about. And then if you look at how much cleaners still get back, they still get back 60%, which would be about 3,000 or so, and in Singapore it would be about 600. So 3,000 as compared to 600. The PAP likes to say, look at other countries, they are paying high taxes. But because their wages are all higher, as I've said, all developed countries with a GDP per capita of about US $35,000 and above, they all earn higher wages. And even though they have higher taxes, they still get back higher wages than Singaporeans. And Singaporeans actually pay high taxes, but they get much lower wages back in return. If Singaporeans paid even $2,000, this will ensure that they are able to have a minimum standard of living that is required. 2,000 is the minimum wage in Japan. It's about 2005 in South Korea right now. So other countries in Asia with a similar cost of living are all earning twice or more than Singaporeans. If we are paid higher wages, this will ensure that we would have even higher retirement funds, free healthcare. We would pay lesser of our wages into housing. It's a perfect solution. This is actually all doable under the current system in Singapore. So the question now is, will Singaporeans decide for themselves and choose a government that would ensure that this is doable? Free healthcare, adequate retirement funds, affordable housing. That is actually all doable under the current system. So I'm just going to leave this up to you to consider. And thank you for listening to the video today.